Yes, Your Honor.
Before we took our lunch break, we were talking about a portion of the radio dispatch that we heard prior to the lunch break. Do you remember that?
I do.
So we had covered only a portion of the transcript that was played, the radio tape that was played, and now I'd like to turn to another portion of that same radio tape we heard before lunch. Now, do you see what's in front of you, and that's part of Exhibit D, the next portion of that radio tape?
I do.
Now, you asked a question there. Do you have enough less lethal up there? Do you see that?
I do.
Why did you ask Officer Weimer-Skirch if he had enough less lethal?
To make sure that they had enough tools, if they had enough to have different layers of less lethal available to them.
Now, there's another statement made by Officer Weimer-Skirch, and that's at lines 7 through 8. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, what does that say?
Starting on line 7,
Yes.
We have a plan to take him into custody.
Now, do you recall hearing Officer Weimer-Skirch say those words in the dispatch, in the radio dispatch?
Yes.
Now, when you heard those words from Officer Weimer-Skirch, we have a plan to take him into custody, why didn't you ask for more information about the plan?
One of the reasons is based on technology, and we found out the hard way from experiences that people are able to tap in and hear our transmissions back and forth to each other using their computer. So we got into the habit of either switching frequencies, that is a secure frequency, or we will call each other on a department phone.
Okay. So is it fair to say that over the radio you would not discuss a plan in order to maintain the security of the plan?
Yes, most of the time that's correct.
And what adverse consequences have you experienced during your career with individuals learning about your plan before you were able to execute your plan?
It puts officers in danger, and again, it gives offenders the ability to read into our plan and plan for either an escape or a way to counter our plan.
So it's fair to say that the way in which you approach all SWAT activations, that when you're making assessments about the plans, those are things that will not be communicated, is that right?
Yeah, usually not.
And has nothing to do with the James Boyd incident, that's just the way that you go about doing your business over the radio.
Yes.
Now, when you asked Officer Weimer-Skirch if he had enough less lethal, what concerns did you have when he didn't immediately answer you?
My concerns is that he was busy. He was extremely busy up there, might not be able to get to the radio. I understood that, but I still was adamant about asking him, because if he did need that resource, I had 2 officers that were arrived and I could send it up to him.
Please explain how you delegated the task of obtaining additional less lethal tools to Officer Ornelas.
Officer Ornelas showed up at the scene at the same time as Officer Perez. They both checked in with me. I asked kind of an open question to both. Do either one of you have a beanbag shotgun? Officer Ornelas said, I do, and my vehicle is just close by right there. And that's how he ended up actually being assigned the beanbag shotgun.
And because Officer Ornelas had the beanbag shotgun, you chose Officer Perez to go to the inner perimeter?
That's correct. Officer Weimer-Skirch was still asking for bodies. I wanted to get him as many as I could, as fast as I could, so I sent Officer Perez up to that position, and then when Officer Ramon Ornelas would come back with the beanbag shotgun, then I would also send him up.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to the efforts to take Mr. Boyd into custody and to help us orient to the time at which these statements were being made. I'd like to have you focus on Exhibit A, which is the CAD, and have you from the CAD tell us what time this particular communication is taking place.
1928 and 49 seconds, and that's going to be 7:28 p.m.
Now, who is making the communication?
That's 754. That's going to be Officer Scott Weimerskirch.
And what is Officer Scott Weimerskirch saying that was reduced to the incident history in the CAD?
Subject not compliant with 34's commands. Wants to walk downhill with his bags.
Now, when you were on scene, you didn't have an opportunity to read this CAD, is that right?
No, not all of it. And especially as once I arrive from 1920 on, I'm no longer in my vehicle, so I'm not observing any of this.
But you did hear over the radio Officer Scott Weimerskirch making this particular dispatch, is that right?
That's correct.
At this time, Your Honor, I would like to play Exhibit C2, which is the APD radio dispatch, from 44 minutes 19 seconds to 44 minutes 28 seconds, along with Exhibit D, the transcript of Exhibit C2, and that would be page 43, line 11 to page 43, line 14. Okay. Page 43. And then when you're there, it's lines 11 through 14.
I think this is the same thing we just played from. I think this is the same thing we played right before lunch.
No, we played 43, line 1, oh, sorry, line 8.
Through,
So
I'm
that
sorry.
was through page
Mr. Robles, what
45,
is
line
that?
2, so is it
what lines are you reading again? This is 43 lines. Oh, all right, that's my turn.
Subject said he wants to get his bag and walk down, but not complying with his own himself. We have a plan in place if it comes to us.
Now, it's correct to say that Officer Weimerskirch told you on 2 separate occasions over the radio that he had a plan in place.
That's correct.
And in this particular radio dispatch, Officer Weimerskirch told you, quote, "We do have a plan in place," and again, "we do have a plan in place if he comes toward us."
That's correct.
Now, you didn't ask Officer Weimerskirch what that plan was in case Mr. Boyd came towards them, is that right?
That's correct.
And that's to maintain the security of the plan, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, is it unusual in your experience for someone like Officer Weimerskirch to tell you on 2 separate occasions over the air that he has a plan in place?
It's a little unusual.
And why do you say that?
Usually one time is enough, and especially if I acknowledge 10-4, I understand you have a plan in place. But when he repeats himself, I understand the urgency to letting me know they have a plan in place. And that's why, at that point, I, again, do not want to get on the radio and bother him with all sorts of details, because there's something going on up there that I can't see that they're dealing with that is evolving quickly.
So shortly after that, Officer Weimerskirch made yet another radio transmission. And at this time, I'd like to play Exhibit C2 from the time 47 minutes 14 seconds to 47 minutes 39 seconds, along with the transcript, which is Exhibit D, page 43, line 11 through line 20. I'm sorry. Page 46, line 11 through 20.
That's fine, Your Honor.
Following the 10, And he's going to be putting feedback. We'll have you guys come up with a plan. And it's responsible for an actual particularly kind of safety in ours. That's simple.
If you could display the transcript, which is Exhibit B. Now, there's a statement made by Officer Weimer-Skirch, and let's take that statement right from the very beginning, line 11. Officer Weimer-Skirch says 5-4 to 10. Do you see that?
I do.
Officer Weimer-Skirch is making a radio dispatch directed to you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then just to advise, not complying with any commands to be taken into custody. You understand that to refer to Mr. Boyd.
I do.
And then the next statement also refers to Mr. Boyd. He wants to try to walk down the hill with all of his bags.
I understand what he means there too.
Now, from the way in which Officer Weimer-Skirch was talking on the radio, what could you tell about what was happening at that time?
Again, the urgency in his voice, that negotiations are failing and that a successful resolution may not happen.
Now, you talked about this situation being fluid, if I remember your testimony from before.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
You also said it was rapidly evolving.
Yes.
Now, why is this situation fluid and rapidly evolving? Who's driving it?
Again, we are responding to Mr. Boyd's actions. With his actions, we respond. He's not making any attempts from what the arrest team is informing me or the entry team is informing me that he's de-escalated or he is complying with negotiations. And each transmission that comes in is building upon more of a threat, more urgency, more problems.
Then there are the statements that you made over the radio. Do you see the first one that you made?
I do.
What does 10-4 mean in this particular context?
I acknowledge what he is saying. I understand what he is saying.
What does "I'm going to send 14 up there" mean?
I'm letting him know that Ramon Ornelas, whose call sign is 714, but we just cut off the 7 to make it short. I'm going to be sending him up there. That should let Officer Weimer-Skirch understand that Ramon Ornelas, being the team leader, he's going to come to you, and at that point, you guys will come up with a plan. Ramon Ornelas will probably check in, and this is how it works, and find out what their plan is, and he may change it or he may come up with a different plan or tweak it, but he's usually the one that helps develop the plans. So I'm letting him know that you're having additional bodies coming up there, and one of them is the team leader, and he's going to assist you in the plans.
So, based on having worked with Officer Weimer-Skirch for the years that you have, would he have known that sending 14 means that you were sending team leader Ramon Ornelas?
Yes.
Now, Officer Weimer-Skirch has worked in tactical, is that right?
That's correct.
To your knowledge, how long has Officer Weimer-Skirch worked in the tactical section?
Quite a long time. He was assigned to tactical division and as an EOD officer, explosive ordnance, and then he transferred to K-9 unit. So if I had to guess, ballpark, maybe 10 years, give or take.
Now, in those 10 years, would it be fair to say that he has conducted training with the SWAT team?
Yes, they join us every Wednesday, the training day that we have once a week. K-9 does participate in that.
And it would be fair to say that Officer Weimer-Skirch would understand that if a team leader whom you sent to the location, once he arrives, that he would be in charge.
Yes.
That's how it works on the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team.
It does. I mean, unless it's some rare occasion where the team leader gets there and there's a good plan in place, and then the team leader just, because of the movement or the rapidness of the call, he might just fill in a position. But majority of the time, everybody knows that when a team leader comes up, he will usually be assigned to making the plans, coming up with the plans.
Now, you inform Officer Weimer-Skirch that 714, Officer Ornelas is going to be up with a beanbag. Do you see that?
I do.
So Officer Ornelas, you told him to go up to the scene where Mr. Boyd is located with a beanbag shotgun, correct?
I did.
And then you make the statement, I'm going to have you guys come up with a plan, if it's possible before nightfall, to take him into custody for his safety and ours. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, by communicating that statement to Officer Weimer-Skirch, what was the intended effect on the listener?
It's twofold. You're sending another body, which you requested, more help. And then I'm also sending up an individual with the tool that you also requested. And then the plans and explaining, I understand it's going to be nightfall, which he relayed to me earlier. So I let him know, yes, that is a concern. I understand your concern. And then for them to come up with a plan, and if possible, be able to take him into custody.
Now, this is what you planned on happening, correct?
Yes, my plan was to get him as many bodies as I could, and then slowing it down and eventually making contact with Officer Ramon.
But you would agree with me that sometimes events overcome or overshadow the best laid plans.
Absolutely.
That sometimes you have good plans in effect, but bad luck may change the outcome of those good plans.
Absolutely.
And that's something that you've experienced in your career before.
I have.
You've developed good plans,
Yes.
plans that have been approved by your supervisors,
Yes.
plans that essentially you have practiced.
Yep.
And you would agree with me that sometimes those plans do not work out as expected.
You're exactly right.
Now, turning your attention to the final frames in which the officer involved shooting, I understand that you were sending Officer Ornelas up to the scene. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you had an opportunity to watch a videotape in which you actually see Officer Ornelas move up to the location.
I did.
And you had an opportunity to watch that video previously, is that right?
I have, yes.
And you see Officer Ornelas in that video.
I do.
What I'd like to play now, with the court's permission, is a portion of Exhibit B4, and it's a clip from the 59 minute, 18-second mark to the 1 hour, 1 minute, and 16-second mark, taken from Alexander Thixton's video compilation.
No objection.
Do you see that officer who's running in the background?
I do.
Now, if we could replay it, and with your marker, I'd like for you to identify that officer who you believe to be Officer Ramon Ornelas.
Yes, sir.
You've used your green marker to indicate on Exhibit B4, that portion of the videotape, an officer named Ramon Ornelas.
That's correct.
That's the officer you sent up with the beanbag shotgun.
Yes, it is.
And approximately how far away, based on what you remember, was Officer Ramon Ornelas from the location where the shooting occurred at the time that the shooting happened?
I would guess about 50 yards.
Please play the rest. So it's fair to say that you had a plan in place to send an officer with a beanbag shotgun to be used against Mr. Boyd if the situation arose to do that.
That's correct.
And although you had made that plan, circumstances intervened before that plan could be executed.
Yes, sir.
And you would agree with me that you had intended to send Officer Ornelas, your team leader, to create the final plan to take Mr. Boyd into custody. Is that right?
if he was able to, and if not, then at least there was more bodies up there and we could develop a plan until the rest of the team arrived.
But as events unfolded, your plan to have your team leader develop the final plan to take Mr. Boyd into custody could not materialize.
That's correct.
Now I'd like to play another portion of the APD radio tape, Exhibit C2. The time would be 48 minutes, 12 seconds to 49 minutes, 14 seconds, along with Exhibit D2, the transcript, page 47, line 11, through page 48, line 7.
Any objection?
Yes, just that it's beyond this shooting. So that's my objection. It's beyond the time of the shooting.
So to play from line 11 through line 13, would it be acceptable to the state?
Yes, that'd be fine.
Page 47, line 11 through 13. Page 47, lines 11 through 13.
Yes.
Okay.
And it will be played without transcript in order to be able to clip it the way that we had agreed.
All right, he's regathered his camp. Thing has been deployed. Less lethal.
Now, did you hear that final? I think you,
All right, he's regathered his camp. Thing has been deployed. Less lethal. Entry's moving 22 down.
now were you able to hear that clearly?
I was.
Who was the person making those radio dispatches?
That was Officer James Purdue.
Now, is it correct to say that Officer James Purdue said, all right, he has regathered his camp,
That's correct.
and the next thing that Officer Purdue says is bang has been deployed, is that right?
Yes,
Next statement is less lethal,
that's correct.
and then there's a statement, entry moving 22's down.
Yes.
What does entries moving 22's down mean?
He's relaying to me, because I can't see, that the arrest team, entry team is now closing distance, moving up to where James Boyd is. He lets them know and me know over the air that he is down. He's no longer able to provide any kind of cover and is probably not going to be able to provide any more intel because now they're within his line of sight.
And it's correct to say that as soon as that occurred, you requested for rescue and ambulance to move to that location.
Yes.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor? Point of clarification, there was that audio, or the radio dispatch we just listened to but could not read, and there's entries moving. When you heard the words entries moving, what did that mean to you?
That means they are the individuals who I was in direct contact with, Officer Scott Weimerskirch. His team is now moving up to that position where James Boyd was at.
And when you heard the words 22's down, what did you take that to mean?
He is off of his rifle, which means he no longer is able to cover them and is probably not going to be able to provide me any more intel.
So when you say that 22 James Perdue is down and he's off his rifle, what would you describe to the jury what that would look like?
Sure, well, he would be gathering intel through his optic on top of his firearm. He would be covering the entry team while they were negotiating or doing whatever they were doing. And then at some point, they were moving, and they were moving into his line of fire. So for safety reasons, he now comes off of his rifle, removing the optic from his eye, and he is letting us know, I'm down. I'm basically out of play at this point.
So, based on what you heard over the radio, would it be fair to say that your assessment of Officer Perdue is that he can no longer use his optic, that is the scope on his rifle, to see what is happening?
That's correct.
Those are my questions, Your Honor. Pass the witness.
Thank you. So, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Sergeant, just so I understand though, when 22 goes down, when the entry team, those other officers down below are moving up, he goes down, that's not uncommon in other entry team situations as well, is it?
No, that happens frequently. If we are, example, we have a barricaded subject and we're at a structure and a high ground officer is in charge of keeping coverage on the front of the structure. His field of view is as much as he can see on that front of that structure. He will let the entry team know once if they decide they need to move up or they need to make entry into that structure that he is down. He can no longer cover them. He can no longer provide any intel because he's off of his rifle, no longer able to see into his optic.
So that happens all the time?
All the time.
Okay. So that's nothing unusual about that?
No.
Okay. In fact, at that time, you're understanding the only two officers on that hill that had lethal force to stop Mr. Boyd was Mr. Detective Sandy and Officer Perez, right?
Objection misleading.
Clarify what you mean by on the hill.
The only ones that were right there as part of the team that could actually shoot Mr. Boyd to stop an immediate deadly threat was, in fact, Detective Sandy and Officer Perez, correct?
Same question, Your Honor, misleading.
I wasn't sure who had less lethal as far as taser shotgun. So as far as anybody who was lethal, unsure, but I assumed that based on Officer Perez arriving at the time he did that, he would be cover.
Okay. Just a second here. Just give you a couple. So, Your Honor, can I use the Elmo? Do you, is it up? Am I supposed to sit something here? I'm not sure what's. Please. Apparently we had to hit the power button, Your Honor. Sergeant, yesterday, the prosecutor, Ms. Begin, asked you about this picture, right?
That's correct.
And she implied to you that when you arrived, these individuals down here in the right-hand corner, Detective Sandy and others, were at that location when you arrived. Do you remember that line of questioning by the prosecutor?
I do.
And you agree with me that you didn't arrive until what time?
7:20?
Okay. And so are you still standing by that testimony that these folks were over in this specific location when you arrived?
What I know is that they were south of James Boyd. And again, I couldn't see where their locations were. I could not identify where they're at because of the terrain That's why I needed to ask, where are your positions?
Well, if I would tell you that this is a screenshot of Mr. Thigston's video, and it was shot between 6:10 and 6:23, you would not have been there at this time, would you?
That's correct.
Now, did you know that they moved up in this area?
I did not.
You did not?
Only until they advised over the radio that they had moved a little bit farther east.
Right. Do you know that they were at two different locations here at two different times?
I did not.
Okay. All right. Talk a little bit about, going back to some of the SWAT stuff you've talked about. Are there skills and training possessed by SWAT officers that do not involve deadly force?
Absolutely.
And an example of those are, for example, CIT negotiators, less lethal, things like that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And would you also agree that other non-SWAT APD officers have some of these same skills?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You mentioned, let me put it this way. You said you did not know, you did not find out who was going to be hands-on in this situation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
It's also, and that's the prosecutor asking you that question, right?
Yes,
And you would agree with me that you never asked, right?
that's right.
Take you to Exhibit 1. And if you recall, that is the exhibit involving, well, you may not know by numbers, but remember we talked a little bit about the use of force SOP?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me just draw your attention to what's been marked as Exhibit 1, and specifically the second page, G, and I'm not referring to the pink highlighted area this time. I'm referring to the paragraph just above it. And if you can see that, can you just read this last sentence right here out loud? The United States Supreme Court.
Yes, the United States Supreme Court recognized some allowance must be made for the fact police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions with limited information in situations which are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving.
Would you agree with me that the day in question, March 16th, 2014, that that's exactly what was taking place on that mountain?
Objection,
Yes.
Your Honor. Objection, Your Honor. I think he doesn't know what happened this year.
Just to be clear about your answer, let me just ask it again so it's clear for everybody in the court to hear. Would you agree with me that that sentence describes exactly what was happening on that day in question in the foothills of Albuquerque?
When I arrived, yes.
And we've heard that several times in just the radio communication between yourself and Officer Weimerskirtz, haven't we?
Correct.
And he, in fact, you've already testified that he, in fact, is actually expressing to you some real concern that things are starting to move really quickly, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And again, why is that a problem for him right then in that minute?
Because he has to make some split-second decisions. He,
That's-
again, is reacting to the actions of James Boyd.
Okay. James Boyd is determining at that point in time what action is going to be taken immediately. Isn't that true?
That's true.
So I put here under your name, sir, that Boyd is determining the action. You'd agree with that?
I'd agree with that.
Now, do you have a copy of the transcript that we've been going through in front of you by any chance?
I don't, sir.
Okay. I understand. Let me just ask you a few questions about that. Would you agree with me that it was not Keith Sandy, from what you've understood from the radio traffic, that it was not Keith Sandy, it was not him that had anything to do with withdrawing the 34s or the field officers?
Yeah, I've never heard any transmissions while I was there of withdrawing field officers.
In fact, Officer McFarland was the one that suggested that the 34s, and he was the one that sent out that the 34s should start being withdrawn, correct?
I wasn't there when that occurred, but from reading, yes, I understand that he was the one that made some of those decisions.
And just to be clear, Officer McFarland is with which unit?
Tactical SWAT.
Okay. And Officer Weimerskirts, let's talk a little bit more about Officer Weimerskirts. Officer Weimerskirts is part, and I'm just putting that symbol for an officer, but Officer Weimerskirts is actually a tactical officer, right?
That's correct.
Is tactical, and to be clear, SWAT is tactical, right?
Yes.
And to also be clear, I think you've already testified, every single week, Officer Weimerskirts, with his canine, trained with SWAT. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. Both units trained together.
So when you say things like he would know that that was a certain officer's number, call sign, that's because of the intimate familiarity you all had because you worked together so much, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so did you have, on that day in question, did you have trust and faith that Officer Weimerskirts was a well-trained officer?
I did.
Did you have trust and faith in believing that when he told you he had a plan developed in case Mr. Boyd started walking down, that you would think that that would be a decent plan?
Yes.
Okay, and why is that? Why do you believe that Officer Weimerskirts at that time, on that day, why would you believe that when he said he had a plan to take him into custody if he started moving, why would you think that that would have been a decent plan at that time?
Because based on my experience with him, he always made good decisions on activations, and he had a wealth of experience just because of his tenure in tactical and his training. And so, yes, I expected him to have a plan or a reasonable plan, enough to get by until Officer Ramon Ornelas showed up at the scene.
Now, you would agree with me also that, and just so I understand, are you familiar with an Officer Sedler?
I am.
Okay, and who is he?
He is a SWAT officer.
Okay. And are you familiar with the fact that he was informing you of who was doing the face-to-face?
I kind of recall him explaining over the air.
And when you say over the face-to-face, if an officer were to say to you, so-and-so is doing a face-to-face, what would that mean?
That means we have visual. We both have visual of each other, myself and the individual that I'm talking to.
Okay. And in this context, it would be that if it said 5-4 is doing the face-to-face, what would you understand that to mean?
I would understand that to be Officer Weimerskirts doing negotiations.
Doing negotiations with Mr. Boyd. That was what you'd understand that radio transmission?
That's correct.
And do you recall that that took place?
I do.
And do you also recall that he informed you that Detective Sandy with rope and Detective Ingram were also 56?
I don't remember Ingram, but I remember Detective Sandy, yes.
Your Honor, can I approach? See if it might help your memory if you
Sure.
refresh your memory if you took a look at the transcript?
Thank you, sir.
I just shoot the top of 42. Refresh his memory at the top of 42.
Yes,
Okay. And so, what did that refresh your memory?
it did.
Okay, so did in fact, Officer Sedler, in fact, tell you that Detective Sandy with rope and Detective Ingram also 56?
Yes.
What does that mean, also 56?
It means that they're arrived there on scene.
Okay. And at one point, you actually conversed with, when you heard, shortly thereafter, when you heard that Detective Sandy was there, you actually reached out to him over the radio, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. And did you have any problem with Detective Sandy being there?
No, I didn't.
When you asked him for information, did he provide that to you clearly?
Yes.
When it came with developing any plan or telling you that a plan had been developed, that was all Officer Weimerskirtz, wasn't it?
That's correct.
So Officer Weimerskirtz was doing the plan, right?
Yes, sir.
You'd agree with that?
I'd agree with that.
Okay. So we talked about this just briefly earlier, but when Officer Weimerskirtz tells you that he has a plan, you're okay with that, aren't you?
Yes, and that's probably who I would have went directly with anyway, based on him being a tactical officer, his training.
And based on your training experience, you would have understand that when Officer Weimerskirtz told you he had a plan to take Mr. Boyd into custody if Mr. Boyd started moving or anything like that, that would be a layered approach, isn't that right?
That's what I assumed, yes.
Okay. And that's an assumption based on the fact that not only is that the way that SWAT is trained, but that's the way that SWAT and K-9, including Officer Weimerskirtz, has been trained, right?
That's correct.
And that's also based on the experience that you have had with Officer Weimerskirtz, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, is there anything wrong with what's been known, and I think you've referred to it already, as a layered approach or a layered plan?
Layered response, no. It's the safest way to take a person into custody.
And explain just briefly again what a layered response would mean.
It's having the ability to have different types of less lethal on hand, because again, failures just based on technology, or if the subject is not incapacitated by that particular type of tool, then we can switch to another one.
Okay, so a layered approach means different types of non-lethal, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, again, we get back to the fact that Mr. Boyd may determine, in this particular type of situation, Mr. Boyd may determine when that plan actually begins, correct?
Yes.
And that's based on his actions, right?
Yes.
So would a flash bang, a noise diversionary device, I'm not exactly sure of the technical term.
Yes, sir.
But would that be part of a reasonable layered approach plan?
It would.
And to explain to the jury why flash bang is reasonable in this situation, the type of situation we're dealing with.
A noise flash diversionary device, as I explained earlier, is a device that when it goes off has a extremely loud sound, bright light, and it's good for a diversion. It's good for getting divided attention, getting a person to stun them for a bit and then be able to maybe apprehend them with other less lethal.
Okay. So if Skirch had been thinking, or you had known that he had been considering a flash bang device as part of his plan, you wouldn't have had a problem with that, would you?
No.
You mean one?
I'm sorry?
You said search.
Did I say Skirch?
I knew what you meant, Your Honor.
Does he sometimes go by the nickname of Skirch?
He does.
Okay. I apologize to the court. Officer Weimerskirch.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I'll tie my tongue up enough time saying that name. But a flashbang would be reasonable, correct?
It would.
Okay. Now, a taser shotgun. In fact, there was some communication between you and Officer Weimerskirch about whether or not he had a taser shotgun up there, right?
Yes, he asked for more or less lethal, and I said I would send him up a taser shotgun, and then eventually the dialogue, because of the radios or whatever was going on up there, he relayed back, no, we already have that, we need a beanbag shotgun.
Okay. So, but a taser shotgun, would that be reasonable in a barricaded subject type situation like this, would a taser shotgun be reasonable as part of a layered approach?
Yes.
Okay. So taser, shotgun, reasonable. Now, Officer Weimerskirch was actually a canine officer, correct?
That's correct.
And that means that he has a canine dog, a dog. He's a dog handler, right?
That's correct.
And these dogs oftentimes are necessary to use to apprehend suspects. Isn't that correct?
That's true.
And they actually go up, and if necessary, they bite on a subject. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And there's many. What are the reasons why you would let a dog loose to bite on a suspect in this type of a situation?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your
What are
question?
the reasons you would have a dog released in this type of a situation?
It's another form of less lethal. It's another tool as far as a layered response.
Okay. And in this instance, would this be a reasonable tool?
Yes.
So a canine released would be reasonable for a plan in this type of approach, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that whenever you have non-lethal, you also always have lethal. In other words, when you have one of these, an officer carrying a taser shotgun, you always also have another officer with a lethal tool. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And why is that?
Again, less lethal fails. Either a defect in the tool or the subject just isn't affected by that particular tool or a combination of tools. It doesn't do the job and incapacitate him.
So, are you aware of any experience that a flashbang has failed to have the desired effect on a subject?
Yes.
So you're familiar with that flashbangs have failed, right?
That's correct.
Taser shotguns have failed in the past to have the desired effect, right?
That's correct.
And man's best friend dogs have from time to time failed to have the desired effect on subjects as well, right?
That's correct.
And that's all based on your many years and experience in SWAT, correct?
Yes, sir.
You've seen these failures with your own eyes, right?
I have.
In fact, you just said it, but I also think you said on direct, less lethal options often fail.
They do.
So, now, has it been your understanding ever that when a canine officer releases his dog, that he immediately follows right up behind the dog?
No, that would be it's out of my expertise as far as dog handler, but I couldn't intelligently answer that question.
You've never seen it happen, have you?
Well, Your Honor, I'm going to object. He said he can't answer that question.
Well, that should happen. I'm asking if you've ever even seen it happen.
I'll allow the question as to whether or not he's ever seen that.
You ever even seen a dog handler release the dog in a real-life situation and immediately follow behind it?
Not that I can recall, no.
You mentioned earlier on that you were concerned in this particular situation because of I think you used the word position of advantage, elevation.
Yes, sir.
correct?
Yes.
Can I get an exhibit, Your Honor? Thank you. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as States Exhibit 74. And the Elmo, Your Honor?
It's on.
There's no one? Do you see this?
I do.
Okay, this is a screen print of an animation that was done in this matter, but it points out the fact that Mr. Boyd stands 3.63 feet above and 9 feet away from officers at the time he was shot, is what this is portraying the elevation aspect of this, difference in, this was when they finally moved up, as you know, but the elevation of where Mr. Boyd was compared to the arrest team and all the other officers, how did that cause you some concern?
Proximity being that close, with the elevation of James Boyd, with gravity, he would be able to close distance quickly because he would be running downhill, and he can see what activities are going on below him as far as where officers are positioned.
Okay. And so in your training that you experienced all the way back from the academy, and I think you were talking about it earlier, the reactionary gap
Yes,
and dealing with edged weapons such as in the Tooler drill, are you familiar with that?
I am.
Okay. All of those issues, when someone is at a much higher elevation than an officer is, that causes a real disadvantage more for the officer, doesn't it?
It can come into play, yes.
Because, as I think you just articulated, because the subject who is elevated can close ground quicker when he's uphill, right?
Yes,
Which then again narrows the opportunity for the officer to react to any actions, correct?
correct.
Now, you mentioned that oftentimes less lethal force doesn't always work, right?
Yeah, it's not always.
In fact, you said it often doesn't work, right?
It depends. Some forms are better than others as far as the less lethal tool.
Okay. But when you deal with trying to take someone into custody, and by the way, there was no doubt Mr. Boyd had to be arrested, right?
Yes, at that point, I'm with the crime that I understood that was going on and his demeanor and citizen safety, yes.
There was no way that the Albuquerque Police Department, after him pulling out knives on officers, was going to let him walk into the forest, right?
That's correct.
And you weren't going to let him walk down the hill right into that neighborhood, were you?
No.
Under any circumstances was that going to happen, right?
No, we're going to keep the integrity of the inner perimeter.
And would it also be fair to say that Officer Weimerskirtz, in those last few seconds before before lethal force was used on him, that from that point all the way previous to that, that arrest team could not let Mr. Boyd get on the move.
That's correct.
As long as he kept his knives on him, he could not bend down, pick up the bags, put them on his shoulder, and start walking down the hill, could he?
No.
Why couldn't he do that? Why couldn't Officer Weimerskirtz let that happen?
Again, he'd be closing the distance, creating an officer safety issue.
At some point, are you familiar that Officer Weimerskirtz let the dog, well, let me ask this. At some point, are you familiar with the fact that a flashbang was used?
Yes.
Are you familiar that it didn't have the desired effect on Mr. Boyd?
And I didn't know that at the time.
You didn't know it at the time. You know it
Yeah,
now, right?
I do, yes, I do know.
You also know that the taser shotgun was used on Mr. Boyd, and it did not have the desired effect either.
Your Honor, I think it's beyond his personal knowledge about this event.
You know it now, don't you?
I do.
That it's hearsay, Judge.
Okay. So did you know at the time that the taser shotgun didn't work?
I did not.
Okay. And you didn't know whether or not the K9 had worked or not either?
I did not.
But if they had worked, there'd be no need for lethal force, right?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
If they had worked, there wouldn't have been any need for lethal force, would there?
That's correct.
Now, I want you to think of the following situation based on your training and experience. Imagine that you have a barricaded subject, similar to what you were dealing with out there in the foothills, or the exact same for that matter. And you have an officer, I think the contact cover officer description of the way you all are trained was described in great detail when Mr. Robles was asking you questions, correct?
Correct.
A cover officer with lethal force, what is his job?
Objection, Your Honor, hypothetical of a lay witness.
He's a SWAT sergeant. I'm talking about training experience. What's the job of a cover?
Rephrase it that way.
What is the job of a lethal cover officer?
To deploy deadly force if he sees that another officer himself or a member of the community is in immediate jeopardy of receiving great bodily injury or death.
And they are trained that that is their one responsibility. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and it's covered in the use of force SOP.
Right. But a cover officer in SWAT or anywhere else in APD, as far as you understand it to be, is trained that their one job is to protect that officer that they're covering, correct?
That's correct.
To not let anything bad happen to that police officer by the subject that they're dealing with, right?
Yes, that's one of their responsibilities, yes.
And so they don't talk to the office, they don't talk to Mr. Boyd, do they? I mean, they don't talk to the subject, do they? A cover officer wouldn't be engaged in negotiation in any way, would he?
No, he shouldn't be.
And you have no information that Mr. Sandy ever said a word to Mr. Boyd, do you?
I do not.
The job of a cover officer, though, if someone comes at the officer that he's protecting with a knife, is to do what?
To deploy deadly force.
Shoot him. In most instances, that means shooting the subject, right?
Yes,
And that means continuing to shoot him until that threat has stopped, right?
that's correct.
And the way you earlier described that was, it's 2 bullets first, and then a third one if this threat is still there, correct?
Yes, it's a standard defensive response and assess. Stop the action.
Now, we talked about earlier how these instances sometimes are rapidly evolving. You've said that several
Correct.
times today, haven't you?
I have.
And in an instance in which an officer, any type of officer, makes a mistake, and that person and that officer who's negotiating perhaps with the subject gets too close to the subject, the training and experience, does that mean he puts himself in danger?
Correct.
It's too close.
Okay.
Does that mean the cover officer's job, because it's this officer's fault he got too close, does that mean the cover officer's job is over?
No.
Does it mean he quits on this guy and says, you got too close, I'm not making sure you're safe anymore? Is that what that means?
No, that's not what it means.
So how is the Albuquerque police officers trained to deal with that situation if the officer that they're covering makes the mistake and gets too close to the bad guy with knives? What is the cover officer supposed to do?
He's going to deploy deadly force.
And that is the way he is trained, isn't that right?
That's correct.
In fact, that's his sworn duty to deploy that lethal force, even if that officer made a mistake, isn't it?
If it is necessary, yes.
And that what makes it necessary is the cover officer's perception, that split second that we've been talking about, of an imminent deadly threat, correct?
Objection. Ultimate issue, Your Honor.
I'm not asking the ultimate issue of whether or not Mr. Sandy
And
was
asking
fair
for
for
a
justice.
legal conclusion as well.
I'm not.
Let me have you comment.
back up for a second. Would you agree with me that a cover officer has to move up with the officer that he's covering if the officer he's covering is moving up?
Yes, just to make sure there's not a crossfire. Or if he's in a position of advantage, he may not have to move up, just depending on where he's positioned.
Okay. We talked about the use of force SOP that's been labeled as Exhibit 1
Yes,
in
sir.
this case, and you've actually just read a sentence from it. You remember that?
I do.
You would agree with me, wouldn't you, that as far as the standard procedural orders of the Albuquerque Police Department, if one officer who's dealing with a subject who's armed closes ground even improperly and shouldn't have closed ground, that if this officer shoots him because of the imminent deadly threat, shoots the subject, that is not a violation of the standard operating procedure use of force, is it?
No, if he can articulate the threat and it fits the criteria of the officer being in immediate jeopardy of receiving grave bodily harm or injury or death, then yes.
So would you agree with me that if a armed subject is 9 feet away, approximately a little bit over 3.5 feet above an officer, and takes a step with 2 knives, one in each hand, towards an officer, that the cover officer would be justified pursuant to the use of force policy in shooting that person?
Objection, the ultimate issue, Your Honor.
Just a couple more minutes, Your Honor. You mentioned earlier when Mr. Robles was asking you questions about a silhouette, a target of a gentleman with a knife that you all train with. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And if in fact that silhouette pops up, and the gentleman with the knife and someone, for example, Sir Officer Perez, who's been training this, did not shoot them, that you would go back and kind of go through it all, the training, and try and make sure that that decision-making process in the future is that he does shoot that threat, right?
Yes, depending on the situation where the target was set and based on the training exercise, yes,
And that's because you're able to do that in training, right?
we are.
And in real life, though, if the person doesn't shoot, maybe there's a dead police officer, right?
That's correct.
Can I have just a moment, Your Honor? We talked about sworn duty before, right?
We did.
And when you are acting as a cover officer, your sworn duty is to stop an imminent lethal threat towards a fellow officer, isn't it?
Objection asked and answered, Your Honor.
I'm sorry.
She's correct.
Okay. What do you understand the word, and what do you teach your people that work for you duty means?
Means doing what you're supposed to do, doing what you have taken an oath to do.
I don't have any other questions, Your Honor.
We've got about 15 minutes of redirect, and so the question is whether you'd like to take a break with the jury now, or whether you'd like to take a break or go into redirect.
We're okay to go ahead.
You're holding up okay, Sergeant?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, all right. I actually want to use this, Mr. Bregman, if I can, your chart. I've been wanting to use it all.
Not on mine, don't write anything on my sheets. If you
All right.
want your own sheet, that's fine, but I would
I want to go
prefer-
back to the front. I won't write on it. I'll just
This is
flag it.
Debbie's- What is she doing?
Hold on. Ms. McGinn can reference what's written on the sheet, but she cannot write on it.
All right. Is that
Very
okay?
good, you can reference anything you want, don't worry.
All righty. I want to start, Sergeant Fox, with where Mr. Bregman started, and I think a big focus of what Mr. Robles did too was this very first statement that he made, that it was your impression that why this sped up was that Mr. Boyd had suddenly made the decision to pick up his bags and unprompted had decided to walk down the hill. Was that your impression at the time?
That was part of it. That and whatever happened during negotiations was not successful.
Well, yes, sir. And the reason you had that impression is because of the radio dispatch that Mr. Robles played, where Scott Weimerskirch said to you he's not complying with commands and wants to walk down the hill with his bags. Is that where you got that impression?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and of course we talked about you were not privy to the conversations that were happening between these three folks about their plan to arrest Mr. Boyd, were you, sir?
That's correct.
Infers or implies evidence that is not in evidence, Your Honor.
And you were not privy to the audio tape that was recorded on the taser cam of the conversations between these three people?
No, I was not.
Okay. And so you were not aware that before this radio dispatch where Sergeant Weimerskirch said that he was coming down the hill and picking up his bags, were you aware that these three had, as part of their plan, had decided to go up the hill and try to trick Mr. Boyd into surrendering so that they could get the arrest?
Objection, testifying and leading, Your Honor.
Were you aware of that aspect of their plan?
Same objection, Your Honor. She just testified for 5 minutes and then goes, were you aware of that plan?
I believe there was a question of whether or not this witness was aware of the audio recording of the three officers. He said no.
All right. Were you ever told by Officer Weimerskirch that he was actually the one that asked Mr. Boyd to come down the hill himself before he sent you this radio dispatch?
No.
And, Your Honor, State's Exhibit 10V, which has been marked into evidence, which is the transcript of the audio tape. Were you ever told that Officer Weimerskirch...
Are we reading into the record something that has not been admitted, or has it been admitted?
It has been admitted, Your Honor. And I'm going to read him the exact quote to see if he had ever heard that from Officer Weimerskirch. Yeah, 10B.
Then he is in
Pardon? Yes, V as in victory.
Which part is it? Because parts of it have been admitted.
Page 28, lines 23 through 25. So, were you aware that before he radioed to you that he's coming down the hill and isn't obeying commands, that Sergeant Weimerskirch was the one that actually asked Mr. Boyd to come down the hill?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. And let me show you 28 lines, 23 through 25. No one here is here to harm or kill you. We just want you to come down off the side of this hill. And then again, over here on page 29, it was Officer Weimerskirch that said, line 15, well, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to lie to you, man. I need you to come down here. And that is why Mr. Boyd said, that's what I'm going to do then. You weren't aware of that?
No,
Were
I
you,
was
Sergeant
not.
Fox?
I was not.
And then let me show you where the dispatch was. It's several pages beyond this where the taser cam records the dispatch that you heard. This one here, several pages later, subject says he wants to get his bags and walk down, but is not compliant and won't disarm himself.
I don't think this is being taken in context.
Oh, I think it is completely, Your Honor.
Okay.
And will you take the exhibit 7C?
Yes.
And turn it to...
I will. So Sergeant Fox, it wasn't Mr. Boyd who suddenly decided to come down. It was Officer Weimerskirch that asked him to come down the hill. Were you aware of that, sir?
Yeah, that's improper characterization of the evidence, Your Honor.
You testified on cross that you can't control what a defendant will do. Is it true that you can't control what non-SWAT officers who will not communicate with you or follow your directions will do?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Had they told you before they went up, at 7:20 you arrive, I just want to orient us, 7:20 you arrive, and then they move up close to Mr. Boyd after you arrive, is that right?
That's what I was told later, yes.
All right. Had they told you before they went up the hill that they were planning to ask Mr. Boyd to come down when just the three of them were there, what would you have said to these three guys?
Relevance, Your Honor.
They did not tell you that that's what they were going to do, did they, sir?
Objection, testifying and leading.
Also been covered, so it's repetitive and I'd like to move along.
All right. Would you have the authority to tell them not to do something if you thought it was unsafe?
Yes, I have the authority to do that.
All right. If they were going to approach this man alone and had told you that without other officers going with them, what would you have said in response to that?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor. Now they're asking for a hypothetical. None of this happened, so.
Had they talked to you about the second part of their plan, that is, that one officer assigned to lethal cover was going to throw the flashbang, one officer assigned to handle was assigned to handle the taser shotgun, and one was going to handle the dog, and they were all going to use this all at once. Had they told you that, would you have any criticism of that particular plan?
Same objection.
This is in direct response to him saying, do you have any problem with any of these things? Okay.
Sorry, ma'am, can you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. Had they either come down the hill to meet with you before they went up to deal with Mr. Boyd, the three of them come down, or talked to you on the radio, that their plan was that that the three of them were going to confront Mr. Boyd alone, one would be assigned to lethal cover and was going to throw the flashbang, one would be assigned to handle the taser shotgun, and the third officer was going to handle the dog, and they would use all these three non-lethal forces at once. Would you have had any suggestions or criticisms of that plan?
Objection, Your Honor, to the form of the question. She now says they again infer that she's assuming facts, not evidence. She's leading and she's testifying.
Okay. Sergeant Fox, do you know how long it was after Weimer-Skirch told Boyd that they wanted him to come down from the hill? How long it was before Mr. Boyd then said he would come down and picked up his bags and started coming down the hill?
I do not know.
Because you didn't even know that they had asked him to come down the hill, did you?
That's correct.
All right. You talked about Defendant Perez being an APD combat, or being a combat veteran before he came to APD, and you talked some about his training. Does APD have any training to help somebody from the military who's been in war make a transition from the military use of force to civilian use of force? Is there a difference in the military use of force versus civilian use of force?
I would be uneducated to answer that. I've never been in the military, so.
Okay. In the military, who are you trained to kill?
Objection. Question calls for speculation.
And lack of foundation.
Okay. Have you heard of the concept from your training in both you training officers in firearms, the concept of sympathetic fire?
Objection outside the scope.
Beyond the scope.
It's not beyond the scope, Judge. They went into all his training as having experience in both training police officers on use of firearms and his own use of firearms.
If it relates to the training of SWAT, that remains.
Okay. Do you train officers in the concept of sympathetic fire?
All of the officers understand what sympathetic fire is,
Okay.
yes.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Sympathetic fire is if an individual fires his firearm, sometimes other people that within proximity will also fire their duty weapon.
And why does that happen?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor. You asked about the training.
Okay. Let's talk about, you talked a little bit about the training and qualifications of SWAT on redirect with, on cross with Mr. Robles. And you said you review past complaints of abuse of force to see if the officers who are applying to SWAT have past complaints of abuse of force on other people. Why do you do that?
Because we want to make sure that we're getting an officer that has common sense and good decision making and is not coming over with a large amount of use of force that is not justified.
Okay, and you also do psychological testing, I thought you said, of the officers as well?
Objection, beyond the scope, Your Honor.
No, Judge, I think that's what was brought out by him.
There is part of that, yes.
Okay, so what kind of officer are you trying to exclude from SWAT with both the psychological testing and looking to see if they have past complaints of abuse of force?
An officer who has a history of disciplinary problems, use of force problems, bad decision making, bad work history. We don't want anybody that is going to cause problems for the department or SWAT team or the general public.
Okay, are you looking for somebody to exclude people who might be a bully, for example?
Objection, leading.
All right. What kinds of personality types are you trying to avoid at SWAT?
I don't know if I could really go into personalities. Basically, it's all based on just records. You never know what kind of personality you're going to get until they actually come to SWAT. So we have to rely on documentation from their past history.
Okay, if someone is getting on SWAT to prove how tough they are, is that somebody who'd qualify for SWAT or not?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Have you ever heard of the concept of somebody who has a heavy badge?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Let's talk about the rope officers. Is it unusual for rope to respond to a SWAT call-out?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
I don't even understand that
Therefore,
objection,
it's
Your
not
Honor.
relevant.
I don't even understand that objection. I think he asked specifically about people who trained with SWAT and people who didn't. I'm allowed to explore who didn't train with SWAT.
This is not training, this is about responding to SWAT calls.
All right. Defendant Sandy wasn't one of the people who ever practiced with the SWAT team, is that right?
Not on a regular basis, no.
Okay, and rope officers don't have the same kind of special training that SWAT officers do.
Some do based on their history or their past history and training.
If they'd been with SWAT before they went to rope, for example.
Yes.
Okay. Defendant Sandy never was in SWAT before he was in rope, is that right?
He was. He was a state police tactical officer.
Okay. Have you ever felt the need to call out the rope team to help the SWAT team do its job?
No, we've assisted the rope team in operations, but I can't recall of any time that I needed to call them out.
Okay. You talked about immediate deadly threat, and the key to the immediate deadly threat is the immediacy of the threat. Is that right?
Yes, that's part of it, yes.
Okay, and I think the way Mr. Bregman phrased the question, that when a knife is involved, if the person comes at the officer, that would pose an immediate deadly threat. Is that right?
Yes, if a person is moving towards you with that weapon, yes, that would be immediacy.
Okay, and you've testified before in another proceeding that with a person with a knife, well, let me back up. It is wrong to shoot a person with a knife who is not an immediate threat to you. Is that right?
Yes, depending on the circumstances and proximity and different things, it could come into play.
Okay, and one of the things about a person with a knife as opposed to a gun is that as long as you're a safe distance away, there is no immediate threat. Is that right?
Leading, Your Honor.
Is it correct that there are things you can do with a knife that you can't do with a gun, as far as creating safety for the officers?
I'm sorry, ma'am, can you repeat?
Yeah, it's getting late in the day.
No.
Sergeant Bucks, it's okay.
Sorry.
There are things that you can do to protect yourself as an officer when the person has a knife that you can't, that it is more difficult to do when they have a gun.
Depending on cover and concealment and your positioning,
Yes, sir.
there are some factors that come into play that, yes, you may be able to.
And one of the things that your officers are trained to do when someone has a knife is to create what?
Objection leading, Your Honor.
What are they trained to do when somebody has a knife?
We always try to create distance.
Okay, and can the officers control the distance between them and a subject?
No,
Leading, Your Honor.
Is a person an immediate threat if they are obeying an officer's commands?
again, it would depend, or, do they have a weapon pointed at me? Are they overtly surrendering?
That's
a lot
exactly
of
where I was
that
going to go.
depends.
Okay, is a person a immediate deadly threat if they are surrendering?
Overtly surrendering? Maybe not, but I need to look at body posturing. Where are they holding the weapon? Or is it a ruse that they're saying they're going to surrender? But it would have to be overt, weapon on the ground.
How you recognize someone is surrendering, one of the ways you can recognize that is whether they're following the officer's commands or not. Is that right? Is one of the ways that, let me ask, what are some of the ways that you can tell that somebody is surrendering?
If an individual is complying with an officer's commands.
So if an officer says, get on the ground,
Objection leading, Your Honor.
what if the command is to get on the ground? What do you look for the person to do?
We're looking for that individual to comply.
Okay, and what does that mean when you say comply?
That means that that individual is getting on the ground.
Okay. You talked about the aim points, you talked about sighting and started down the path of explaining what I think was an iron sight, sighting from the back to the front. Is that right, sir? Is that where?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You understand that's not the kind of sight that Defendant Perez was using, is that right?
Objection leading.
Was that the kind of sight that Defendant Perez was using at this time?
No, he's using a aim point.
Okay. And let me put up what's been marked as 48D. Can you show the jury on that picture where the aim point sight is, sir?
Circle it, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Let me try to get I'm trying to move this, so get this out of the glare for you there, but it's not working very
I'm
well.
good. I can see it.
Okay, all right. All right. And is that also known as a red dot site?
Yes.
And what does it do as far as placing internally a red dot on the person you're trying to shoot?
This is cumulative now. We've already heard testimony about this issue before.
Not from this-
Witnesses. This is cumulative.
Not from this officer.
The red dot system is basically the same principle as the iron sights. The red dot acts as the front sight, and you hold high center mass on the target.
Okay, and you put the red dot on you try to put the red dot on the person? Is that how it works?
On the target, that when you're ready to shoot, that red dot is placed where you want the round to go.
Yes, sir. And do you use that with both eyes open?
You can.
Okay, is that how all your officers are trained?
A lot of them, it's preference. Some squint the non-dominant eye. Others use their both eyes open. It just depends.
Okay. When you were shooting in a situation like this, do you have to be able to see things other than just what you can see on the sight?
Yes, yeah, I mean, your field of view is important.
Because especially if there are people and other officers in front of where you're firing. Is that right, sir?
Objection leading, Your Honor.
Why is it important to have a field of view in this particular situation, sir?
To be able to watch the suspect, you have a better field of view to see what the suspect's doing, seeing the hands, seeing the posturing, what their actions are.
Okay, and do you also want to see what the other people in, yes?
If I don't start hearing what, when, how questions,
Right.
I'm gonna be the one to stop you.
Okay. What other concerns do you have when there are other people in front of your gun?
If there are other people in front of your firearm, then you can create a crossfire situation.
Yes, sir, and as far as field of view is concerned, what are your concerns for the people that are in front of your gun?
I guess I don't understand, ma'am. If you're, other than crossfire, or you don't want to cover one of the other officers.
Why is it important to be able to have a field of view and to be able to see people who are in front of your gun?
For safety, and to make sure that everybody is safe is around you, and just be able to see exactly what the suspect is doing.
Who does he have to worry about hitting when he fires in this particular situation?
What particular situation?
Well, Your Honor, I'm trying to ask who, what, when, where, why. Who, in this particular situation, in this particular situation where there are officers in front of you and a subject in front of you, who do you have to be concerned if you're shooting about not hitting? Maybe that's a better way to phrase it.
You want to make sure about the other officers near you.
Okay, and how does a shooter avoid hitting the other officers who are near you?
Can reposition, or he may be in a position where they're not in your direct line of fire, so
Okay.
you may not have to reposition. It depends. It depends on what the shooter has at the time, or where he's at, the terrain, the environment.
Is it important to be able to see with the field of view the other people who are in the field of view there?
Yes, that's important.
And is it important to be able to see movement if somebody moves?
Yes,
Okay, for example, if one of these officers moved towards the subject, would it be important for the shooter to be able to see that?
yes.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned, I think, in response to one of the cross-examinations was that your goal was to slow down things.
Yes, that was the hopes.
All right, can you tell me how you would do that in this particular situation once you arrived?
Yes, again, getting that inner perimeter, locking that inner perimeter down will allow me enough time to activate the rest of the tactical team, try to get negotiators there quickly, establish negotiations, slow it down as much as I can, and then build on the call with whatever resources I need to bring in.
Okay, how does it affect your ability to slow down the situation if someone asks Mr. Boyd to come down the hill?
I guess it depends on that person's behavior or what they're dealing with.
Okay, can you explain to me why nobody told you that they had asked Mr. Boyd to come down the hill?
Objection, speculation.
What resources did you have that you could have employed that evening?
And I'm going to object. It's been asked and answered. He's gone in great detail on what resources there were there.
Yes, it is, Judge. Okay. Did anyone administer first aid to Mr. Boyd at the scene in the first 7 to 15 minutes between the time rescue arrived?
Can we approach?
Sergeant Fox, I think somebody, and I can't remember which one of the defense lawyers asked you this, about was there any chance that Mr. Boyd wouldn't be taken into custody? And I think somebody asked it, is there any chance he wouldn't have been arrested? Can you tell me whether, had Mr. Boyd not been shot, whether he would have been taken to the UNM hospital for a medical evaluation versus being taken to jail?
Objection, relevance.
I think it's in direct response to their question, Judge. Do you take everybody that you arrest in this kind of situation to jail?
Objection, relevance, Your Honor.
Okay. I just have one more question, Sergeant Fox, then I'll let you go. Okay?
Thanks, ma'am.
Can we talk you into coming back to APD, sir?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Judge. That's all the
Thanks,
questions I
ma'am.
have.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Judge, let me give you the third question before I walk off with it.
And then I wasn't sure if we got 20 documents.
Yes.